When we talk about China's global power, we often focus on technology, on Taiwan, on trade, and even military modernization and diplomacy. But Chinese state action abroad also plays out much closer to home through surveillance, through intimidation of the diaspora, on legal pressure, financial coercion, and even attempts to silence critics far beyond China and Hong Kong. I'm Dominic Bowen, and I'm host of the International Risk podcast, where we unpack the topics that really matter. This month, two men were convicted in London under the UK's National Security Act for assisting a foreign intelligence service in a case that centred on authorities from Hong Kong, centred on pro-democracy activists and shadow policing right on British soil. And this episode asks what the case actually reveals about the wider risk, about how democratic states should be protecting their open societies, how they should be protecting diaspora communities, and even their public institutions from transnational repression, while still managing that complex relationship with Beijing. To help us understand and unpack this topic today, we're joined by Sam Goodman, and Sam's a senior policy director at the China Strategic Risks Institute. He's also the co-founder of the New Diplomacy Project. Sam, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Sam, looking forward to the conversation today. Whereabouts in the world do we find you?
So I'm currently sat right now in East London in my flat.
That's a good place to be, especially when we're recording this late at night. So thanks very much for taking the time. But it's a really important conversation today. And before we even get into the UK case, we know that this has been happening around the world. Just last week, a New York man was found guilty of acting as an unregistered agent on behalf of the Chinese government. Now, there was a federal trial that prosecutors alleged that he was operating a secret police station on behalf of Beijing in Manhattan, right in Manhattan's Chinatown neighborhood. And there's been similar investigations and actions have been reported in Italy, in Australia, in Canada, France, Germany, Ireland, Japan, and even the Netherlands. So, how should our listeners who are listening from around the world understand Chinese state action abroad today?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's quite distinctive about China and the Chinese government compared to other governments is that they consider the diaspora to be an extension of the Chinese state. And they're very keen to mobilize the diaspora. They're very keen to put under surveillance members of the diaspora that speak out against them. And even if you're a dual national, an Australian national, an American national, it doesn't matter if you're an American national, an Australian national, a Canadian national, or even sat here, a British national. If you're ethnically Chinese, the Chinese state is interested in you. And through its United Front Work Department, it will monitor you. And it has a global network that undertakes surveillance, but it also seeks to mobilize the diaspora to pursue the goals and the aims of the Chinese Communist Party and to essentially tell China's story well.
And I think that telling China's stories well is a really important one. And I'm keen to talk about the UK case with you, but even just in the last couple of days, my podcast feed and my news feed has been full of the increased reporting in the US about China and their active espionage threat inside the USA with this emphasis on the recent American political official who was tied to Beijing and tied to transnational influence operations and that coverage coming out of the US has been talking about Chinese activity as part of this wider information campaign involving China, Russia, Iran. And this case that the US prosecutors have recently been pushing said that a former mayor in California of Arcadia, I think her name was Ellen Wang, she was working at the direction and the control of Chinese officials. And she was running a website that was posing as a local Chinese American news outlet. It was publishing pro-Beijing material. And I think this broader pattern and the pattern of this case really fits with Chinese efforts to cultivate local intermediaries who can shape messaging, who can mobilize diaspora audience, who can provide access to US political networks and even influence local and national politics and discussions within the USA and other countries. When you hear about these cases and you read about these cases, not just in the UK, but around the world, how much does this concern you?
Yeah, I mean, I think many people would be rightly concerned about this because this is not necessarily the normal behavior of a foreign state. And clearly, often behind these relationships, there's a stated goal or an aim, right? Whether that is to acquire a particular piece of technology, whether it's to essentially buy influence, or in sometimes, I mean, even mobilizing individuals to really silence criticism and silence critical voices within the Chinese community itself. And that really undermines the basic freedoms of many of the countries that we all live in, where people, whether they're our citizens or whether they're foreign nationals living in our country, they should have the right to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and certainly, freedom of political views.
And when we talk about the UK case, I understand that centered around two people, Bill Yuen and Peter Y. Now, they were convicted in London under Britain's National Security Act for assisting a foreign intelligence service while targeting dissidents from Hong Kong and pro democracy figures who are now living in Britain. Now, prosecutors from the UK said that they carried out surveillance, they were gathering intelligence, and they were conducting deception on behalf of Hong Kong authorities. Now, they also said there was attention that was paid to politicians such as Ian Duncan Smith. So, Sam, what does this case reveal about how Hong Kong and Chinese authorities are actually able to operate on British soil?
Yeah, I mean, what's crazy about this case is it reads like something out of a spy thriller, but also if the spies at the center of it were in the thick of it, if you know that political TV show in the UK or Veep in the US, if you're more familiar with that, where essentially you had the manager of the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office, which is essentially a separate entity to the Chinese embassy, but it's full of Hong Kong diplomats, essentially paying individuals using the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office's bank account to undertake espionage on UK soil to monitor activists. One of them had a fake police warrant card that he threw out of the window before he was arrested. And we now know that the two men that went to trial, well, actually, there was originally three, but I'll get on to the third in a second. The two men who went to trial, their lawyers were funded by the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office, while at the same time, the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government were claiming that they had nothing to do with these men. Other than that, you had another eight individuals that the UK police arrested in relation to this case that they had to let go because they didn't have enough translators. And these eight individuals have fled the UK and gone back to China. You also have a third man who's a British national who was in the military, who unfortunately killed himself. He was originally remanded, and he said that if he was given bail, he would kill himself, and unfortunately, that's what happened. So this case is there's all sorts of drama within it. I think what it tells us is that the Chinese government is very interested in the growing Hong Kong diaspora here in the UK that now numbers 200,000, and that for the foreseeable future, they will be monitoring them.
And I wonder, Sam, the use of the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office and use of embassies and consulates around the world, it's not just the Chinese, but it's the American, it's the British, it's the Australian. Most countries use various forms of cover to collect intelligence, to understand their allies and understand their adversaries and collect information and build relationships. So if we put that critical lens on this, how should we look at this? Is this any different to what the good guys are doing overseas, or is there something different about how China's operating in the UK, for example, and what this case showed us?
Yeah, I think it's important to say that democratic governments do not police the behavior of their nationals overseas or people who may have an ethnic link to that country. That doesn't happen. That is very much the case of what China is trying to do today in Britain. They're trying to silence the voice of Hong Kongers, Hong Kong pro-democracy activists who've come to this country, but also, as you've already alluded to, also the voices of our directly elected politicians who are not Hong Kongers, who are critical of China. And I think that goes far beyond the sort of routine surveillance that countries might do on each other. Clearly, behind some of this action is to silence voices, is to monitor a growing community that the Chinese state still considers to be a huge part of it. Um, and so I think you can see the sort of the contrast between what we might accept or understand as to be reasonable activities that foreign countries take when it comes to spying on each other. I think this sits beyond the realms of that.
No, thanks for making that point. I appreciate that, Sam. And when we talk about transnational repression, I think many of our listeners might imagine dramatic events, abductions, and threats, and spyware, and physical surveillance, and no doubt it does include that at times. But I think some of your recent work, Sam, focuses on economic transnational repression. Can you talk to us about what that is and why it's important, and why our listeners should understand this?
So my research on financial transnational repression has focused on the freezing of activist bank accounts, the revocation of their professional qualifications, the targeting of family members back in China financially, like threatening their jobs or their livelihoods, using the tax authorities to go after individuals, or essentially freezing or withholding benefits that they're legally entitled to, like their pension fund. The reason why we've been quite keen to focus on this area is that it's kind of an undiscussed part of transnational repression. As you rightly say, I mean, we think of the more dramatic elements, an individual being stalked, an individual being forced onto a plane to return home, uh, more violent things, people being beaten up in the streets. But the financial element that's equally coercive and equally can ruin people's lives, we just don't talk that much about. And it matters because China has aspirations to be a financial superpower. Increasingly, China is encouraging countries to use the renminbi. That makes up about 7%, I think, at the moment of global currencies and usage. And at the same time, many multilateral banks want access to China. And so when the Chinese put pressure on these banks, when they give them evidence or they accuse individuals of money laundering, these banks are put in a particularly difficult position as to whether they will follow the laws laid out by China or the laws laid out by the West. And that I think gets to the heart of the problem. Of course, China isn't the only one. The Iranians have done this before, the Turks. Thousands of Russians have had their bank accounts frozen or cancelled since the war in Ukraine began because they've been put on an extremist list. But as China's influence grows, I think we are more likely to see more of these financial levers pulled.
And so for our leaders, and we've got a huge listener base in Europe and North America, Sam. What do they need to understand about their company's institutional exposure, about the legal risks, maybe even employee safety, compliance traps, and the accountability for the business leaders when it comes to companies that are operating in Europe and North America? How can they become unintentionally or even unawarely involved in transnational repression, perhaps without even realizing it?
My research has looked at banks who often are behind the freezing of these assets, and many of the banks, if they were sat with you right now, they would say that they independently look at information that's given to them, whether someone has an arrest warrant out for them, criminal conviction. They don't pass a judgment on what it is, and they give equal weighting to whether this is coming from a democracy or whether this is coming from an autocracy, and that for them they're very process orientated. I think where we would sit is obviously saying that there is a wider context for this and that financial institutions need to properly do their due diligence where they're looking at this information and, of course, give individuals involved recourse to challenge these decisions in the same way that if your bank called you up tomorrow and said, sorry, Dominic, we're closing your bank account, uh, they'd give you a period of time to offer evidence to show why they shouldn't do that, to object. And if you couldn't convince the bank, you could take it to the relevant financial regulator. Something similar should be set up for victims of transnational repression. So I think for the banks, it's about doing more due diligence. We're not asking them to remake the will. This is something that they already do that they could plug into. And actually, in the long run, would save them legal risk if customers wanted to sue them, reputational risk, obviously. You don't want your bank on the front page of a newspaper saying that you're targeting the victims of TNR. And of course, dealing with some of these governance risks as well, where often cases, some of these banks have governance structures in China. We had the Chinese Communist Party involved, and again, they're quite opaque.
But Sam, a phrase that's often used by the US and by British authorities, and even we've seen it in Italy, the Netherlands, and Australia, is about these shadow police stations and shadow policing. Can you tell us what is it? Are they handing out parking fines to Chinese citizens in the UK, or is there something much more sinister? And I shouldn't joke about it because I know it's serious, but tell us what is shadow policing and what are these shadow police stations?
So essentially, a lot of the discussion around shadow policing can go back to a report that was published by Safeguard Defenders in 2022 that found that there were dozens of these shadow police stations across the world that a lot of governments didn't know about. And essentially, they were spaces that were being rented by essentially extensions of the Chinese state, where you had people who were employed who often was settling legal issues or they were shadowing the community. And it really varies as to what these activities are that go on in these shadow police stations. Some of them are monitoring the community, but some of them also will claim that what they're dealing with are legal issues that have to be settled back in China. where they could claim sovereignty over this particular office. So, to give your listeners an example that was given to me when I was asking one of the researchers about this, say there's a Chinese couple and the man is in, let's say, the UK and the wife stayed in China, and they want to get divorced, but they haven't signed the paperwork. The man could go to essentially the shadow police station and sign a legal document granting a divorce to his wife. Now, of course, the problem here is that these people do not have any official accreditation, right, in the countries that they're operating in. They're not officially registered as diplomats with the Chinese, but also the buildings that they're operating in don't have any legal sovereignty to say that they're Chinese territory. That's really the kind of issue that we're facing. Is why we're concerned about the shadow policing, is that you're having individuals from the Chinese intelligence community essentially claiming jurisdiction in our countries outside of embassies and outside of any diplomatic credentials.
And if we can take this all the way back to Hong Kong and to China, can you help us understand? So I think many people understand, as you mentioned, about the Chinese law and how that extends to Chinese citizens or anyone of Chinese ethnicity, regardless of what nationality they may regard themselves. But the Hong Kong national security law, talks about the extraterritorial dimension. So can you talk to us about how this changed and what changed in 2020 and how Hong Kong's own national security legislation is affecting people from Hong Kong who now live overseas?
Hong Kong used to be a British colony. We handed it back to China in 1997, and we did so with an agreement, which is the Joint Declaration, where we said that the limited democracy that the Brits had introduced would be maintained for 50 years, and that included, independent courts, free media, direct elections to their parliament, but also the Chinese promised in this document that the Hong Kong chief executive, who's a bit like a governor, I guess, of Hong Kong, would be elected eventually by universal suffrage. Now, in 2014, the Chinese publish a white paper where they say, actually, this doesn't feel like a good idea. We don't really want to do this. Instead, we'll select two candidates, and you can pick out the two that we select who've been pre-screened. And this led to huge protests in Hong Kong and the birth, really, of the pro-democracy movement there. And then these protests really continue up until 2019, where you have another bill, an extradition bill that essentially would allow Hong Kongers for the first time to be extradited to mainland China to stand trial. And at that point, about 2 million Hong Kongers come out on the street. And given that the population of Hong Kong is close to 7 million, that's a big number. That's nearly 1 in 3 Hong Kongers. Um, Now, this obviously shocked the Chinese, right? They were really worried about this, particularly what really shocked them was this idea of a Hong Kong identity. That increasingly, particularly amongst the young Hong Kongers, they were more associating with being Hong Kongers than being mainland Chinese, which was never the plan, right? The plan in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party was that they got Hong Kong back, they integrated Hong Kong back into China. That was the end of the story. Now, their response to these protests was the national security law that was brought in July 2020, which essentially criminalizes three things. It criminalizes sedition, so essentially saying things that Hong Kong should be its own country, or Hong Kong independence, which was a slogan in 2019 amongst some of the young people. It criminalizes subversion. It doesn't define very clearly what subversion is, so we can discuss whatever the hell that means. And it also criminalizes collusion with foreign political forces, which it defines very broadly and could mean anything from a Hong Kong pro democracy lawmaker going to the US embassy for a roundtable event, to taking money from individuals outside of Hong Kong, if you did a crowdfunder, for instance, for maybe even speaking on a panel right outside of Hong Kong. If Nathan Law, who's one of the pro democracy activists, spoke at a panel in, say, Italy, that could count. And the problem with this law, of course, is that it doesn't just apply to activity in Hong Kong, it applies to activity everywhere. And you don't need to be in Hong Kong. And obviously, as we've discussed, just because you've left Hong Kong doesn't mean that the Hong Kong government isn't interested in what you're doing outside of Hong Kong. And so that's really where I think the problems are with this law, that it's been used to essentially round up all of the pro democracy voices in Hong Kong and put them in jail. But it's also being used to target Hong Kongers overseas who continue to speak out against the Hong Kong government.
And I'd love to hear more about that, Sam, because I understand that Hong Kong Watch, an organisation, released a survey this month that found that many Hong Kongers in the UK actually feel at risk of transnational repression from Hong Kong and China. They said there's that fear of infiltration within their communities, the identification of them in their roles and what they're doing today, but also concern for family members back home. And I guess that means that we could look at these individuals as potential victims of repression, but they could also be threats to many companies. And I know that's the way many business leaders are quite concerned about employing people from Iran, from India, from China, from Russia, countries that have a reputation for repression and a reputation for intimidating family members back home in order to get nationals who are now living in Europe and North America to collect information, to share information. How should we be understanding, people from Hong Kong who are now working in legitimate roles for legitimate companies and government agencies? Are they victims or are they potential threats? How do we understand that situation?
I mean, I think the threat victim dynamic is too binary, right? Like, I think a lot of the Hong Kongers who've left Hong Kong, yes, they're very sympathetic to democratic values. Otherwise, they wouldn't have left Hong Kong and brought their families with them. But many of them want a relatively normal life. Like, they are not uh, going to be doing activism every day of the week. They've come to the UK, they've come to America, they've left Hong Kong for better lives, and about 500,000 Hong Kongers have left since 2020. That's a pretty conservative estimate. I think you're right to talk about the fear within the Hong Kong community. It's certainly something I experienced when I worked at Hong Kong Watch. Every time I talked with people within the community, there is this paranoia that they're being watched and this real risk of infiltration, sure. But the other problem, as you pointed out, is that for those that have their families in Hong Kong, there's always a risk that their family members will be targeted. It's common practice in China for family members to be targeted of dissidents. They're normally invited for cups of tea with the Ministry of State Security, which is a polite euphemism for essentially an interrogation, essentially being sat down and asked about their family members overseas, and then asked to communicate with their family members overseas to get them to stop their activities. And there aren't necessarily easy answers of what local enforcement or what businesses can do really to respond to this.
I'm wondering about the UK's response and proactivity. I mean, there's the National Security Act from about 3 years ago, 2023, that was designed to update the UK's tools against state activities such as this. But we've all seen in the newspaper the controversy of a China's plan for its new embassy near the Royal Mint, near the Tower of London, and of course, it's very close access to really sensitive fiber optic cables. Many people are saying this creates an espionage risk. This, creates even more access to Chinese security services and able to provide a surveillance and pressure on Chinese and Hong Kong dissidents living in the UK. How seriously do you think the current government in the UK is taking this threat?
The problem that the current government has, I think, particularly with the issue of the embassy, is that they inherited this issue from the last government. Essentially, the government of Boris Johnson agreed to sell the site of the Royal Mint building to China. And then we've ended up in a long dispute about the planning permission. I think Boris Johnson's predecessors were less keen on the site, but then the Chinese essentially threatened to the UK and said that if the UK didn't essentially agree to this new embassy site, there wouldn't be engagement on economic talks, but also the UK wouldn't be able to renovate its own embassy in Beijing. I actually was at the one of the first protests outside the embassy when the site was announced that it was going forward. And the one thing I took away was just the huge amount of Hong Kongers that were there. I mean, there were thousands of people, but the lion's share of people protesting the embassy site was the Hong Kong community for the very reason that you've highlighted, which is that many of them feel that this huge and enhanced embassy site will be used as a base of operations to target them.
And I wonder, continuing on with my curiosity around the UK's seriousness and the ability to respond, I've heard a lot of commentators talking about, the rise of AI and how, studying Mandarin and Cantonese is such a silly idea. But, I actually still don't understand that particular analysis because I think cultural understanding and linguistic understanding of our allies and our adversaries is just critical for intelligence collection and security and defense of our countries. So when you look at the police forces and the security services within the UK, you mentioned translation earlier in our conversation. Is there enough linguistic, is there enough cultural understanding to actually identify transnational repression and support local communities and conduct the sort of monitoring and response that we expect of our security services today?
It's not just transnational repression. Also, when it comes to criminal gangs as well, a friend of mine who looks at this, who does a lot of research around Chinese criminal gangs, points to the fact that there's a real lack of translators in the police force for particular regional dialects when it comes to China. So he highlighted the fact that allegedly, a lot of Chinese criminal gangs come from the Fujian province, and that there aren't many translators who understand that dialect. And those that do, these criminal gangs are aware of. So it makes it very difficult if you're a translator, if you're going to translate against people who know you and know your family. I think AI can help. Surely it can supplement some of this, but it's not going to be able to do all the work. One of my big pleas to the government has always been to use the Hong Kong community as a resource, right? These are people who have the linguistic skills. They clearly believe in democratic values because they've come here at great financial disadvantage themselves in many ways as political refugees. And I think they're very keen to help. Of course, you'd have to vet these people, but you should be able to find, 10, 15, 20 Hong Kongers who'd be willing to offer translation services for police forces across the country. And overnight, I think you could really increase the capacity for getting around and dealing with some of these issues.
Oh, well, thanks very much for explaining that, Sam. And one question that we ask all guests on the International Risk podcast is, Sam, I know you have do a lot of work and you've spoken a lot about different foreign policy issues over the years, but when you look around the world today, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
I think if you work on China, you're always going to be worried about Taiwan and anything that will happen in the Taiwan Strait, not just because the amount of traffic that goes through the Taiwan Strait in terms of cargo traffic, uh, but the fact alone that Taiwan produces around 93% of the world's high value chips, the things that go in your smartphones, the things that are powering the AI revolution, and that you simply cannot replace that. If TSMC went out of business tomorrow, um, we'd be in real trouble. And there's been some great analysis done by Rhodium, the think tank, looking at some of the ballpark figures of what a Taiwan crisis might cost the global economy. And it's huge. I mean, it's scary numbers. It would be bigger than the 2008 financial crash and bigger than the economic hit of COVID-19. And in some ways, I think that's what makes it so difficult for policymakers to get their heads around. Even more difficult now today with what's going on with Iraq, right? It's very hard to get people to pay attention to the next huge crisis that's going to change the world when they're still trying to deal with the one that they've got right in front of them. But I think this is something that more people need to be thinking about Taiwan, thinking about the supply chain issues, but also the broader economic issues. And also, I suppose, thinking more about democracy as well. Do we want democracy in the Indo-Pacific region? Are we willing to stand up for democracy, and at what cost? So I think this is always something that I like to remind people about whenever I'm on podcasts or panels, that we should all probably be thinking a lot more about Taiwan.
It'd be remiss noting what you just said then, Sam, for me not to ask a follow-up question. I mean, Donald Trump, president of the USA, just had face-to-face meetings with Xi Jinping in China. And of course, it appears that Donald Trump has come away with, not much more than he could have achieved on a phone call. But Xi Jinping did take the very clear opportunity to talk about non-interference and to not get in the way of reunification with Taiwan. It's been, 24, 48 hours since that visit's completed. How are you feeling when you think about, that visit and what the Chinese state said and how the US responded? How are you feeling today about, as Donald Trump said, the G2 and the risks for, the Indo-Pacific region?
I think structurally what's going on between the US and China right now, with essentially Chinese challenging the Americans economically and geopolitically, and some people arguing the Americans being on the back foot, means that the dynamic and the relationship between them is always going to be fractious. And for the rest of the world, we're going to have to navigate that.
Yeah, thanks very much for that analysis, Sam, and thank you very much for coming on the International Risk Podcast today.
My pleasure.
That was a great conversation with Sam Goodman. Sam's the Senior Policy Director at the China Strategic Risk Institute, and he's the co-founder of the New Diplomacy Project. And I really appreciated hearing Sam's thoughts on how Chinese and Hong Kong authorities are projecting power beyond their borders, but also our vulnerabilities and the associated international risks. Today's podcast was produced and coordinated by Edward Penrose. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again in the next couple of days.